This video is part of my Make Yoga Work series where we look to bring some purpose to your poses, so what you do here makes a difference to your movement off the mat. And in this one we're looking at Warrior 2 pose. Now, Warrior 2 pose, which is this, which I imagine you're familiar with, is one of those poses that looks very yoga-y and is often included just because it looks very yoga-y. I think that it's often put in classes without any real intention or purpose behind why it's there. So in this video, I want to look at why we would put it into a session and what we can do to actually make it do more for you off the mat. So essentially, in terms of the meaning that we look at when we look at the Warrior 2 pose, which I did look up before this video, and one of the meanings was that it energizes the limbs, whatever that means. But I would look at this more as a lower body focused pose, given that if we look at it as a chest opener, I think it has a fairly minimal effect here. So I wouldn't necessarily put this in the class as a chest opener. It's more for what we attain in the lower body here. So we usually look at this pose as a hip opener here. And I think it's something that we miss just due to the position that we find ourselves in, and I guess a misunderstanding of how we really need to position our pelvis in order to open the hips. Usually we see this performed in this manner, slightly leaning towards this front leg with our pelvis tilted towards that leg. Now there's not much chance for hip opening to happen. We might get a bit of load in this front adductor and hamstrings, but if we really want to open hip, I think a lot of work can be done on this back leg here, and it's going to come through dropping that rear pelvis, because in this position here, what we have here is a hip hike on the back leg and a hip drop on the front leg. What we want to do is look to even that up, and in order to even that, we're going to need to drop the rear hip. So if I drop that rear hip, I can already start to feel some solid load come into the adductors on the rear leg. And you probably saw it even wants to drag this front knee in a little bit as I start to get that tensile load across the front of the pelvis. So in our Not Really Yoga system, we look at trying to bring three-dimensional movements to our stretches. So that would be a frontal plane movement. If I really want to bring some load into this rear hip, my sagittal plane movement will be a posterior tilt of the pelvis. So a posterior tilt of the pelvis here, I drop the hip and I tuck under, and now I can really feel this rear hip loading. Notice it's also by dropping that hip, it's centered me in between my feet, a cue that often teachers struggle with as everyone wants to be on this front leg. If we just straighten our pelvis here, we're going to redistribute our weight between our legs. Now the transverse plane that we want to bring in here is we want to look to rotate the knee towards a little toe. And that's really going to wind up this rear hip, and it's also going to fix the cue of people collapsing in on their rear heel or the inside arch. It's actually going to redistribute this weight across the toes and into the heel of the back leg. Another thing that we're very big on in the Not Really Yoga system is isometrics. A couple of ways you could apply isometrics here. Once you've got this position here, the drop, the posterior tilt, and the external rotation of the rear femur, we could really look to wind that knee out to the toe and push in there. That's going to give us a fair bit of loading anyway. But the way I'd probably suggest doing it is doing that, driving this foot down in and pulling the heel back like we're pulling the feet towards each other. That's going to give you pretty solid isometric loading here. And in line with that, another purpose for this pose would be to bring some strength into the legs. We can also look at playing with our weight distribution in our front foot in order to change the focus of some of the muscles in our front leg here. So if I was to drop into it and if I push my weight into my toes and lift my heel a bit, you'll feel the quad really start to fire. And I could then bias it towards hamstrings a bit. If I drive my heel in and pull my heel back, I'm going to feel the hamstrings firing too. It could just be a nice cue just to play with weight distribution a little bit, and also an awareness of where our weight sits in our feet. So that's my take on bringing a bit of purpose into the Warrior 2 pose. If you would like any poses that you would particularly like looked at, please comment below. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, and I will be back with more next time. See you then.